My own children tried to convince me I was going crazy so they could take my $300,000 before I took my last breath. I had already seen the signs, the missing keys that suddenly appeared in the freezer, the thermostat set to 90 in the middle of the night, the brown bottles on my counter rearranged by hands that were not mine. They called it concern. I called it rehearsal. The afternoon they brought the guardianship papers, I poured tea and pretended to read the room slowly. My daughter Lila used the softest voice she owned, the one she reserved for customer service calls and funerals. My son, Evan, kept his jaw tight, his eyes on the folder, not on me. He set a pen on the table as if it might sign on its own. I slid the papers back toward him, careful not to let my hand shake. He read my steadiness as stubbornness. Lila reached for my wrist. Gentle pressure, performative comfort. I let her hold it. I let them believe I was smaller than the woman who raised them. That night, I boiled eggs and waited for the house to settle. The clock in the hallway ticked like a metronome for my rage. I opened the drawer where I kept the old cedar recipe box and pulled out a second set of keys, not for the car, for the file cabinet in the guest room closet. Inside sat the folder I had been building since the day my husband died. Bank statements, copies of my will, a list of names and numbers written in my neat teacher's script. At the top, underlined twice, was the name of an elder law attorney I had met at the library lecture series 6 months earlier. I had told her I was planning a quiet season. She had smiled and said the quietest seasons change the most lives. In the morning, I baked scones and left the house at 9 on the dot, my usual church thrift shift time. Instead, I drove to the attorney's office, a modest suite above a dentist and a yoga studio that smelled of eucalyptus. Her name was Anita Patel. She listened without interrupting, her pen moving only when I paused for breath. I told her about the papers. I told her about the money. I told her that I was not confused. I told her I would never sign my life away. She slid a packet across the desk, far thinner than the one my children had brought. It held a durable power of attorney, naming me as my own agent unless a licensed neurologist and a second independent physician agreed I could not act. It held a revocable trust that would hold my assets and lock like a vault if anyone tried to pry. It held a schedule for cognitive testing at a clinic that did not accept referrals from family members. Finally, it held instructions for a caregiver camera system with cloud storage and a small notice to place by the front door, stating that the premises were under video surveillance for safety. Legal, visible, undeniable. I signed what safeguarded me. I did not sign away a single breath more. On the way home, I stopped at the bank. The manager, a woman my age named Nora, opened her private office and closed the door after offering me water. We had attended the same funerals over 30 years. I told her exactly what I needed. Move the $300,000 into the trust under my name as trustee. Freeze any attempt at external transfer without my voice password and a second in-person confirmation. Flag withdrawals over $500 and call me directly on the landline, not the cell my daughter had once tried to borrow for an upgrade. Nora never once asked if I was sure. She simply made copies, stamped them, and placed them in a folder that looked as solid as a front door. I swung by the pharmacy after. The pharmacist labeled my medications with fresh barcodes and added blister packs with dates. I placed an extra set in a locked tin inside the linen closet. On the drive home, rain began to needle the windshield, and the world looked washed and sharp. I felt the same way. Lila called the moment I stepped through the door. Her voice carried sunshine for the listener and storm clouds for the subject. She said she would stop by with soup. She said we would talk again about those papers. I thanked her and set the kettle on. Then I unpacked the small cameras and set them where the brochures suggested. One above the stove, one at the end of the hallway, one in the living room behind the fern, one in the kitchen, high and crooked, so obvious it would pity. It is, sir. You would make the hidden one matter more. I tested each feed. The images bloomed on my tablet with a soft blue border, time-stamped and stored in a place no one else could reach. By evening, Lila and Evan stood in my kitchen again. Evan held the same leather folder like a waiter holding a check that had grown heavy. Lila ladled soup into bowls and sprinkled parsley with a flourish. She placed a pill by the side of my spoon. She called it a vitamin. I smiled and slid it under my napkin. The camera caught everything. The tilt of her head, the small glance at her brother, his nod, the way the clock ticked, and she started talking about forgetfulness with the rhythm of a lullaby. I excused myself to the bathroom. I flushed the pill. I rinsed my hands slowly until my anger cooled to something focused and usable. They left after an hour, disappointed by my refusal to sign, more disappointed by my refusal to explode. I locked the door and only then let my knees bend. I stood in the hallway, breathing through the urge to cry. I did not give in. I brewed chamomile and watched the recordings, screen bright against the dark kitchen. I saved them to 3 different places. The next morning, I kept my appointment at the clinic. 2 doctors, 1 neurologist and 1 psychologist, tested my memory, my reasoning, my mood. I repeated strings of numbers, forward and backward. I named as many animals as I could in 60 seconds. I drew a clock and set it to 11:10. I described a picture of a picnic without missing the ants at the corner of the blanket. They asked if I felt depressed. I said no. They asked if anyone had mentioned changes in my behavior. I said my children had grown concerned, and I welcomed documentation that could ease their worry. The psychologist smiled at that, not unkindly. I left with a report scheduled for pickup in 2 days. On the way out, I passed an older woman in a floral dress with a man in a stiff polo at her elbow. Her eyes skittered toward the exit like a bird that had learned too late about glass. I held the door for her and she squeezed my hand with a grip that said more than any words. At home, I called a locksmith. New deadbolts, new codes. I called an electrician and had him switch the outlet by my bedroom to a locking cover. I called my neighbour, Ruth, a widow with a gait like a marching band leader, and asked if she might drop in for coffee at odd hours over the next week. She agreed without asking why, and told me she would bring her little dog, Louis, for extra cheer. That evening, Evan arrived alone. He smelled like cologne and cold air. He sat at my table without taking off his coat. He spoke like a man shifting gears he did not believe in. He described debt. He described a business deal that needed a bridge. He said it would fix everything and that he would pay me back. He did not mention guardianship. He did not mention vitamins. He looked at my hands, not my face. I served him coffee and apple slices and asked him to give me the name of the lender he owed. He flinched. He said it did not matter. I told him it mattered to me. He left before the coffee cooled. 2 days later, the clinic called. My results were ready. I picked up a sealed envelope with my name printed in precise, calm letters. The report was thorough. Cognitive function within normal limits for age, no evidence of dementia. Recommendations for regular exercise, social engagement, and routine follow-up in a year. I slid the report into a clear sleeve and then into the folder with my legal documents. I sat in the parking lot and let my forehead fall against the steering wheel. Relief has a taste. For me, it tasted like copper and mint and rain on the lid of a tin. When I got home, the front door was ajar. A draft slipped through the hallway and lifted the lace curtain in the living room. I stood very still. The light in the kitchen was on. I called out and my voice sounded steady. Lila appeared from the hallway with a flurry of words about dropping off flowers and finding the door unlatched. She held a bouquet of lilies that smelled like hospitals. I thanked her and took them carefully, then set them in the sink without filling a vase. She laughed at herself and said she must be jumpy. She looked around the living room the way a buyer looks at a house. I saw it. I named it for myself. Then I walked her to the door and locked it behind her. On the feed that night, I watched the 8 minutes before I arrived. I watched Lila come in with a key she had kept from the days when she watched the kids here on Tuesdays. I watched her open drawers. I watched her slip something into the sugar jar and stir with my wooden spoon. I watched her take the small framed photo of me and my husband from the mantel and move it slightly, a signal to herself, a breadcrumb for later. I paused the video and placed my hands flat on the table. I could feel the grain of the wood under my palms, the same table where we had rolled dough and graded papers and glued together the cardboard solar system Evan made in 5th grade. I changed the sugar jar. I cleaned the spoon with vinegar. I replaced the photo and then placed a small blue post-it behind it with today's date. Evidence stacked like cordwood. Anita called the next morning. She had filed a letter with the probate court indicating that any petition for guardianship would be contested, that medical documentation existed to rebut claims of incapacity, and that any ex parte order would be immediately appealed. She suggested a private investigator to document patterns that might rise to elder abuse. I said yes. She gave me a name. The woman who answered sounded like someone who knew how to sit in a car for long hours without losing patience. For a week, life turned itself into a narrow bridge, and I drove along it without looking down. Evan texted apologies without specifics. Lila oscillated between honey and vinegar. They stopped by with groceries I did not need. They called at odd hours to ask if I had eaten. They brought me tea and tried to watch me drink it. I pretended to sip and praised the flavor. I saved every cup and poured them into mason jars labeled with dates and times. The investigator picked them up with gloved hands. Ruth came by with Louis and sat on my couch while I told her about the weather and the birds at the feeder. She, who had once been a nurse, noticed the tremor in my left hand and asked if it was new. I told her the truth. It was old and mild and always worse when I baked. She nodded and patted Louis. She did not press. The presence of someone who believed me steadied the walls. One night, Lila insisted on making me chamomile and honey. She opened the cabinet without asking and reached for the sugar. I had filled it with marked grains that glowed faint blue under a small penlight. She stirred, smiled, and slid the mug toward me. I coughed lightly and said the steam was strong. I suggested we share. I took a polite swallow and set the cup down. I told her I needed to check the roast in the oven. In the kitchen, I lifted the mug to the camera and whispered the time. When I returned, Leela had pressed the handle toward herself. She drank. 10 minutes later, her eyelids drooped. She insisted she was fine, then confessed she was exhausted. She left with a yawn, saying work had been relentless. The investigator's car followed her at a sensible distance. The next morning, Evan arrived with a stranger in a blue blazer who introduced himself as a social worker. He said he was conducting a wellness check. His eyes were kind but tired, his clipboard full of checkboxes. He asked if I felt safe. I said yes. He asked if I ate regularly. I led him to the fridge. He asked if I ever forgot the stove. I showed him the labeled knobs and the fire extinguisher. He finally asked if I understood why he had come. I said I did. He left with a nod and a business card. The camera caught Evan at the curb, rubbing the back of his neck like a boy caught with a cigarette. The investigator sent me a still frame of the scene, and I printed it with the others. Anita called to say the petition had been filed. The hearing was set for 2 weeks. She recommended I sleep, walk, and refrain from direct confrontation. She would file a motion to strike any hearsay. She would subpoena the clinic's report. She would request the recordings be admitted under the state's single-party consent law. I baked bread instead of pacing. I called my sister in Ohio and told her I might need a witness for 10 minutes of history. She said she would fly in and bring the family Bible if needed. The investigator delivered a neat binder the size of a cookbook. Inside were transcripts of text messages between my children, obtained through a legitimate source I did not care to know in detail. Lila had written about vitamins strong enough to make me nap. Evan had written about timelines and bridge loans. Lila had written to someone named Vince about signatures. Vince had replied with a photo of a manila envelope labeled with my name and a dollar figure. I could feel my pulse under my tongue as I read. The investigator had also included a brief on Vince. He ran a payday lending storefront and an off-the-books business in the back. Evan owed him more than $50,000. The $300,000 had become a dream for men with sharp smiles. I set the binder on the table and stared at the pepper plant on my windowsill until my breathing slowed. My husband had given me that plant from a cutting the summer before he died. It had survived 2 winters and a hailstorm. I pinched a leaf, and the scent of green lifted me like a hand beneath my elbow. The night before the hearing, I placed every document into a leather satchel my husband had loved. I slept with the satchel under the bed, my palm resting on the handle as if it were a heartbeat. In the morning, I dressed in navy and pinned my hair up. I did not aim to look younger. I aimed to look like myself. Ruth drove me to the courthouse and stood with Louis at the entrance while I went through security. Anita met me on the other side with a binder twin to mine, tabs sprouting like careful flags. We walked into a courtroom that smelled faintly of polish and coffee. Evan and Lila sat at the petitioner's table. Evan wore a suit he had not bothered to tailor. Lila wore a pale blouse and pearls that had belonged to my mother. I felt a small tear at the map of my heart and smoothed it with the flat of my hand. Their attorney began with a syrupy introduction about concern and safety. He used phrases like cognitive decline and inability to manage complex tasks. He referenced missed appointments, unpaid bills, and a recent kitchen mishap involving an unattended burner. My jaw tightened. Anita squeezed my wrist once. When it was our turn, Anita stood with a calm that made the room breathe differently. She presented the clinic report first, the one with my clock drawn in a way no one could dismiss. She called the psychologist, who testified with clear, measured words. She moved to the bank manager, who explained the safeguards in place at my request months earlier, not days. She then cued the video from the kitchen. The screen flickered, and there was my home. My daughter, her fingers tapping the pill into the teacup. The room went silent in a way that felt like snow. My stomach rolled. I watched Lila look down at her hands. I watched Evan's face blanch. The judge lifted her chin and asked Anita to pause. Anita did, and then played the second clip, the one with the sugar jar, the stirring spoon, the small, satisfied smile. The third clip showed Lila drinking from the cup she had meant for me, then leaving in a mild haze. The investigator's timeline followed, along with the lab report from the jars, listing a benzodiazepine at a dose that could have rendered a woman my age unsteady and vulnerable. Anita rested her case with a final piece: the texts. She did not read them aloud. She let the pages speak in the flat voice of screenshots. Evan closed his eyes. The judge asked for a brief recess. I sat very still and watched the dust in the light above the bench. When we reconvened, the judge denied the petitions with language that sounded like a door slamming. She referred the matter to the district attorney for review under the elder abuse statute. She ordered a temporary restraining order preventing Lila and Evan from entering my home or accessing my accounts. She scheduled a status conference in 30 days. I walked out of the courtroom holding Anita's arm like I would hold a railing on a steep staircase. In the hallway, Evan stood with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, boyish for a second, then hard again. Lila did not look at me. Vince waited by the elevator and melted into a stairwell when the investigator raised her phone. That night, the house felt both empty and abundant. I sat at the table and made a list. Call locksmith again. Change alarm code again. Call insurer. Call my sister. Call Nora at the bank with a thank you. Call the clinic to schedule a follow-up for next year so the habit becomes part of my calendar. I stared at the last line and then added another. Draft new will with no contest clause and clear conditions. Anita would help. The trust would stand as a wall. I added one more line. Decide what to do with the 300,000 if I leave this world without reconciliation. The district attorney called the next day. A woman with a voice like gravel and sunlight. She asked permission to use the videos. She said the law takes time, but evidence moves it forward. She did not promise anything. She did not need to. I gave permission and hung up with my pulse steady. The news traveled through the family like lightning on a dry field. My sister called and cried for both of us. My niece sent a text picture of a pie she had baked in my honor. Ruth brought over soup and did not use any sugar. The neighbor's teen mowed my lawn and refused payment. The world, which had felt like a room where someone kept turning off the lights, brightened in small human squares. I wrote letters, one to Evan, one to Leela, not to scold, not to beg, to draw a line that would not move. I told them the facts. I told them what the judge had ordered. I told them I loved the children they had once been. I told them I had no space for harm. I told them my door would open again only after treatment, restitution, and proof of distance from the men who had urged them to ruin me for cash. I sent the letters certified and kept the green receipts clipped to the folder in the cabinet. For a week, silence held. Then a detective called to say Lila had confessed to one count of tampering and had named Vince as the source of the pills. She had claimed she only wanted me to rest. The detective's voice did not change tone while he read the phrase. He said the case against Vince was larger than me. He said Evan had retained counsel. He did not ask me to participate beyond what I had already given. I thanked him for his work and set my phone on the kitchen counter. I put both hands around my mug and breathed. I did not want revenge to be my legacy. I wanted protection, clarity, and consequences that taught more than they destroyed. I met with Anita again and rewrote my will. The new plan bypassed my children entirely for now. The trust provided a modest stipend for my grandchildren held in a spendthrift structure with educational and health clauses. The bulk of the 300,000 would seed a small fund through the local community foundation to help older women hire lawyers, locks, and caregivers who answer to them alone. We called it the Quiet Harbor Fund. I signed with a hand that did not tremble. Spring lifted its shoulders, and the garden began to show its work. I raked leaves from the flower beds and watched the tulips push through. I joined a walking group at the senior centre and learned a new route across the river. I went back to the library lecture series and sat in the front row. When I heard a soft voice ask if the seat next to me was taken, I looked up to see the woman from the clinic in a fresh floral dress. She sat and we listened to a talk about local history. Afterward, we shared a cookie and said our names. Hers was June. Her son had tried something similar. She held herself straighter when she said it. We exchanged numbers. A month later, the status hearing arrived. The judge reviewed the updates in a voice that brooked no nonsense. The order stood. The referrals remained active. The courtroom had fewer people. Evan did not come. Lila sat in the back with her hands folded in her lap and left without speaking. Outside, Ruth handed me Louis's leash while she ran to get the car. Louis and I stood in the sunshine and watched a pigeon parade across the sidewalk like a mare. For the first time in weeks, I laughed. The sound felt like water poured into a glass. That night, I opened a wooden box my husband had kept on his dresser. Inside lay the small, ordinary artifacts of our life: a tie pin, a ticket stub, a paper heart folded by a grandchild. I laid them out on the table and let memory bless me without drowning me. I thought about the children I had tucked into bed. I thought about the teenagers who slammed doors and chaise and came back to apologize. I thought about the young adults who had needed help and sometimes asked for it badly. Love is not a shield against harm. Love is what teaches you when to draw the line and hold it. Summer came. The district attorney called again with an update. Vince had taken a plea on charges unrelated to me, but including the kind of predatory lending that swallows families. Lila had entered a diversion program for first-time non-violent offenders. Evan had settled a civil matter with a creditor and moved out of the county. I listened and nodded and ended the call with a simple thank you. I stood in the kitchen and pressed my palms to the cool countertop. The world does not always give back what it takes. Sometimes it gives you a quieter house and a stronger spine. In August, a letter arrived in Lila's handwriting. It did not ask for money. It did not excuse. It stated facts and regret. It included proof of therapy and community service. It did not ask to cross my threshold. It asked for a meeting in a public place with a mediator present. I carried the letter to Anita, and we read it together. She said my boundaries were mine. She said I could say no. I said I wanted to hear, not to fix. She arranged a room at a church with good light and chairs that did not wobble. Lila sat across from me with a box of tissues she did not use. She spoke without spinning. She spoke about fear. She spoke about debt. She spoke about a man who told her older women slip, and no one notices. She spoke about choices she had made that she owned fully now. When she finished, I told her I was not a lighthouse for her shame. I told her I was also not a courtroom. I told her I needed a year. I stood up and walked out without hugging her. I did not cry in the parking lot. I drove to the grocery and bought peaches. I went home and ate one over the sink while the sun lowered itself onto my windowsill. September brought school photos of my grandchildren. I placed them on the mantel with small frames that matched. I wrote each of them a letter for their future, one for 18, one for 21, one for 25, held at the foundation to be delivered when the time came. I told them the stories my children had loved when they were small about the way their grandfather danced while stirring tomato sauce, and the day the dog brought me a glove from the baseball field like a trophy. I told them about kindness that takes the shape of actions. I told them about money as a tool, not a mirror. The garden moved toward fall, and I pulled up the last of the peppers. I set the ripest 3 in a basket and walked them over to Ruth. The air held the first bite of cold. She thanked me, and we stood in her doorway like women who had traded weather updates for witness. She said I looked taller. I told her I felt like myself again. The house no longer hummed with surveillance in the same nervy way. I still kept the cameras, but they became background, like the refrigerator's low purr. I cooked in batches and filled the freezer with soups labeled in my careful hand. I volunteered at the shelter on Thursday morning and kept the fund's paperwork tidy, writing checks to women who needed locksmiths and consults before a looming hearing. A letter arrived from one of them with handwriting that had not been used for years. "Thank you," it said, "for believing me when I did not have a binder yet." On the first snowfall, I set the kettle on and watched the flakes tilt and settle. The house felt good around me, not a fortress, a home. I thought of the day my children had placed the pen on this very table and tried to shrink me. I thought of how I had not broken. I lifted my mug and let the steam wash my face. The past few months had taught me that endurance can be quiet and still count as courage. I had learned to fortify without hardening into stone. Weeks later, the doorbell rang. Ruth stood with 2 envelopes from the mailbox, one from the court, thin, one from a charity, fat with a newsletter. The court letter confirmed the expiration of the restraining orders and the continuation of the no-contact condition unless initiated through counsel. The newsletter featured a note about the Quiet Harbour Fund and a photo of a key being placed into the palm of a woman whose shoulders had just dropped an inch with relief. I taped that photo inside my pantry door, where only I would see it before breakfast. Winter eased, and a new year began. I wrote my calendar in ink. Doctor in March, tax appointment in April, roses in May, review legal file in June, beach day with Ruth in July. I filled the days because empty days invite voices that do not love you. I made my list and checked it with satisfaction that had nothing to do with fear anymore. One afternoon, I opened the cedar recipe box and found a folded note in my husband's hand. I had forgotten it was there, tucked beneath the card for lemon bars. It read simply, "Be kind to yourself first." I set it on the table and let it look at me. Kindness did not mean weakness. It meant seeing clearly and making choices that kept the flames steady. I lit the small candle in the kitchen and let wax pool like a quiet punctuation. Months passed. I did not hear from Evan. I heard through a cousin that he had taken a job 3 states away. I wished him well without sending a note. Lila wrote again at the 1-year mark, as I had asked. She enclosed a timeline of her life that did not center me. She offered restitution for the fees I had paid, with a money order that made my hand tremble when I opened it. I deposited it into the fund without ceremony. I wrote her back with 2 sentences. I told her I was moving forward, and that the door would stay on a chain until trust held on both sides. She did not reply. The silence felt honest. On an ordinary Tuesday, I rolled dough for bread and remembered the sound of my children's small footsteps on these floors. The memory did not injure me. It rested in the same place as the scent of yeast and the warmth of the oven. I had survived the kind of betrayal that rearranges a woman's mind. I had protected what I built. I had turned money meant to be plundered into a harbour. I had not become bitter. I had become clear. The timer chimed. I pulled the loaves out and set them on the rack, the crusts singing as they cooled. The sun slid across the counter and made the crumbs look like gold. I lifted one loaf and placed it on a plate for Ruth. I wrapped another for June and tucked a note under the string. "See you Thursday." I breathed in the smell of home and let it travel through me. They had wanted a signature. I gave myself a life instead.
My grandma told me this story. I have many more stories. Subscribe so you don't miss the most